Good evening, I'm John Batchelor. This is The John Batchelor Show. I'm joined for the first time in 2016 by my colleague and co-host and friend, Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, the host of Opinion Journal at WSJ Video. Mary, we're in a storm, and those of us who do the news every day, this week has been unusual in that there has been no opportunity to do a day two of a story.
John, it's not even a storm, it's a hurricane.
We have day one of each new crisis. And today, the markets fell apart, which was the second part in a week. We're getting used to this, Mary. Following the breakdown in all predictable order in the Gulf, the breaking of diplomatic relations between the apocalyptic Wahhabists of Saudi Arabia and the apocalyptic Mahdists of Iran. And then there was this claim of an H-bomb test in North Korea. And I'm not even doing the details here. I'm just getting on the big picture. It's exhausting for those of us who like to think that we're at the front lines of where the news is. We're overworked and we're losing parts of the stories, Mary, because we don't have a chance to go back.
That's right, and that doesn't even mention the 50 more police cadets killed in Libya. It doesn't mention this news out of Germany, John, that New Year's Eve, I see you take a big breath in.
Yes, that's an ugly story.
Okay, well, let's move on.
So there's lots of nastiness.
So many ugly stories.
And it's early January, so we're very pleased to be welcomed by our colleague, Victor Davis Hanson of the Hoover Institution, writing most recently and discerningly about part of the American political class that finds it useful to blame America, or as Victor puts it in his essay, Hating America Incorporated. Victor, I start with all the crises. The crises are us that Mary and I are living through here in New York, because it is a way of illustrating that with all of America's foibles, weaknesses, inconsistencies, unfinished business, doubts, reversals, and we can do it better, all of that, we are the best nation to be in a storm such as we're experiencing right now. First, does the Hating America Incorporated crowd, do they recognize the irony of blaming a place that protects them and guarantees their children a home and an education? Good evening to you, Victor.
No, they don't. Thank you. They don't recognize it because it's mostly a very wealthy elite and then sort of a multicultural anger at the lack of a quality result. In other words, because America for the elite is not perfect and it's not good. And most of these people are very affluent, and they feel that America should be perfect in the way that technological progress, their apps work perfectly, their computers work, their BMWs work, so why can't morality work perfectly in the way that they see it? And they're completely insulated from, they're not on B-17s over Schweinfurt in 1944 like their grandparents were. So they don't have elemental existential challenges. They're not dirty. They're not under their house trying to fix the plumbing at night. They're not out in the South 40. And the combination of affluence and leisure is created on real expectations. And they're very influential. They're a very small part of the population. But when you look at these large urban centers where, the high finances, where you look at the universities, the foundations, the media, politicians, they have a very intolerant view of imperfection. And then there's other people who, for a variety of reasons, have claims against the United States, and they hope to translate those into careerist advancement. Every time you look at a campus and you see some type of protest, ultimately it's like a rug bazaar where they're haggling with the president, and he gets out a checkbook and writes a check for another diversity vice provost or another black studies class or another safe space with somebody else's money. So I can understand that a lot better because it's rational. They want something, and they're going to agitate for it. But as far as your earlier point, look at the world abroad. It's always been a pretty awful place compared to a constitutional republic like the United States. That's a multiracial society. It's the only one that's ever worked, really, in the history of civilization. And but why we're worried right now is because the last 8 years, to paraphrase Reverend Wright, the chickens are coming home to roost. We borrowed $10 trillion, and we've tried to stimulate the economy with, cheap gas from fracking, which the president opposed, and zero interest rates. But boy, when you regulate the economy and you have this health care entitlement and you expand the federal government, you don't deal with entitlements, and you borrow $10 trillion at some point you don't have very many stimuli left, and the economy's starting to look like that. And then abroad, people are saying, whether it's in North Korea or Iran or ISIS or Putin or the Chinese, whoever it is, they're thinking, that it's likely that you're never going to see a president like this again. We've never seen one in the past, and we're not going to see one in the present that is ambiguous about the moral and political and strategic role of the United States. So we've taken all of these aggrandizements the last 7 years, and now we've got one more year. So we better hit the gas and do what we can before the next president comes in.
Victor, is there a natural limit to this hating of Western civilization, and in particular the United States? I'll use the example on the micro level of the college campus. As you say, these students may want their administrators to write them a check for another diversity chief, but how do these universities continue to fund themselves, the alumni that don't like this sort of thing?
The check is always what it always is. It's money. And when the federal government backs student loans, and the university knows that, then they've doubled the rate of inflation, double rate of tuition increases, and i.e. student expenses, dorms, all that at twice the rate of inflation. And the idea was the federal government would give these kids money, and then they would have a cause célèbre every 10 or 12 years, and they would get debt relief, and the whole thing would get going. And the problem with that is that there's private diploma mills growing up everywhere. There's engineering schools, there's technical schools, there's the internet, and the degree that they're turning out, these very $60,000 degrees, there's no guarantee anymore to an employer that these people can reason inductively, they can write well, because the curriculum and the grading has been therapeutic. And people basically graduate, and the employer looks at them and says, what was this major? What was this environmental studies major? What was this Chicano studies major? What was this community studies major? What was all this stuff? And when they get these young kids out, it's tragic, because I've seen it, and I've been trying to hire people over the years, and when I see a graduate, I see a kid with $50, $60, $80, $100,000 in loans, and yet they're totally inept because they were never given the practical skills to make them competitive. And it's kind of ironic, because in the sciences and business and medicine, people all over the world are coming to our universities, but in the liberal arts and these non-scientific, non-mathematic, non-professional schools, it's really not a very good deal anymore. You don't get any skills as far as the job market, and you get no skills as far as being broadly and liberally educated.
Victor, is there an opportunity now for people to review? I mean, everybody makes mistakes when they're young and they listen to their college professors, and then you go out into the world. For example, the Chinese miracle might not be a miracle. We're watching a tattered dictatorship meet the markets, and the markets are rejecting their idea.
Yeah,
that's why we're seeing that. And does that is that going to be visited upon the American student?
I mean, that's why I get so frustrated by a column by Tom Friedman, which is always the latest fad is better than we are. And basically, throughout the last 2,500 years, to the degree that a society is constitutional and transparent and honors free market capitalism,
and has courts that are backed up by enforcement,
independent judiciary and free market capitalism, no matter what the cycle is or what its current problem is, it's always going to be better off in the end. And we've seen that throughout the 20th century. So right now, for all of our problems, the question is, are we not whether we're perfect, or are we better than the alternative? And when you look at the EU, and which is the best alternative, and it's not very good, and then you look at Russia's paradigm, or China, or the Middle East, and what do you see? You see the world is corrupt, you see it's tribal, you see it's misogynist, you see it's socialist, you see that it's authoritarian, it's totalitarian. It's only here, and that's borne out by 25% of the immigrants come to the United States, and about 80% come to the West in general. So, people vote with their feet. And the irony is, if you listen to getting back to the critics of the United States, the Chicano studies professor or the La Raza professor should be, according to his own ideology and rhetoric, he should be down at the border telling the 500,000 people who come every year, get out, stop. It's a very oppressive place. It's terrible. You wouldn't want to suffer here like I have. Go back to Mexico. Go back to Oaxaca. But they never do. And that's the fatal contradiction with all these critics, that they're sort of they feed at the trough of capitalism and freedom and transparency, and then they have the the margin of error where they can critique or they can bite. They are almost like a medieval jester. They make fun of their palace that feeds them, and they're buffoonish, and it's really sad because these people are entrusted with the education of our kids.
Well, Victor, perhaps the global disorder will be a major wake-up call for this generation as they eventually get sent out to fight and to quell these parts of the world.
But I want to try now, Victor, at the beginning of the year. This doesn't look short-term to me here in New York. Does it look like it's going to ebb this year, or could this go on for some time? We'll pay for sins for 8 years.
No, I think it's going to go on. I think there's certain problems inherent in the world economy and the world post-world order. Post-world order was sort of it was sort of like a wild stallion that the United States got on, and it could guide it. And the United States under this administration jumped off, and we don't know where this stallion's going, but we see politically, economically, militarily, strategically, the whole world is...
So you see the disorder continuing, the new presidency will not be a remedy.
It's worse than 1980 when suddenly there were communists in Central America or Russians in Afghanistan. We had stagflation throughout the world, and Carter was saying we had to turn our thermostats down, and that so-called malaise speech that it was gloom and doom, and then there are hostages, and the Shah and China was in Vietnam, and then Reagan sort of said, I got to restore deterrence.
That sounds simple in comparison to where we are now.
Yeah, it does, and I feel sorry for the next president because for all the talk about Obama came in with all these problems, he came in with an economic solution that pretty much stopped the meltdown in 2008, and we had stability in Iraq. We don't like to talk about that, but we did. And there was a pattern or a plan or a paradigm to deal with Afghanistan, and we had a war on terror that had really worked. And I don't see that same landscape for the next president. I think he's going to have to deal with it sluggish. I mean, what are the tools to get the economy going? Zero interest rates, cheap fuel. It's been tried, and the only thing I can think of is to lower taxes and to stop regulation.
Oh, Victor, we can all just take comfort with the fact that the lights are still on. We'll feel good about that in a few years.
Victor
Davis Hanson reminding us very, very carefully that if you don't like America, you're still in the best rowboat going. Mary Kissel, the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal and the host of opinion journals at WSJ Video. I'm John Batchelor.